Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
I'm now joined by a resident economist, Marc Coleman. Marc, since it's the first show of 2024, I think it's only apt to ask for your economic outlook for the year ahead.
Happy New Year to you and all your listeners, Karl. So it depends which economy you're talking about, the multinational economy or the indigenous economy. The last set of forecasts I saw were from the ESRI, which were kind of inverting what you and I were talking about in the preceding year. Last year, we were saying, look, the multinational sector is going gangbusters, but the domestic sector is not going well. And there's an element of reversal in that I think we've seen jitters in the IT and pharma sectors. We saw job losses there. In Cork, 300 jobs being lost in one of the multinationals there before the year. But the ESRI is saying more positive outlook for the indigenous sector. And that's true, but that does not translate into the feel-good factor. And I think here's where we're now in an election year. We're going to have European and local elections in a couple of months' time. We may well have a general election in November. So when I tell you that in aggregate terms, the indigenous economy is not going to do too badly, that is in macroeconomic national accounting terms. What I think politicians repeatedly fail to understand is that this does not create a feel-good factor for three reasons. Number one, the macroeconomic aggregates do not necessarily reflect higher disposable income. And because the tax cuts in Budget 2024 were a lot less than they were trumpeted, and we've spoken about this, increasing the tax threshold for the higher rate of tax was welcome, but it ain't a tax cut because it just about is running to stand still with the rate of inflation. It just about compensates for inflation eating into your pay packet and pushing you into a higher pay bracket. The second reason for the lack of the feel-good factor is simply that the cost of, even with the rate of inflation coming down, the cost of living is now so excruciatingly high that you need 4 or 5 years of good, strong growth in the indigenous economy, sustained years to offset that. And we won't have had enough of that by the time the next elections come around. The third reason why I think the feel-good factor is not going to materialize is that, unfortunately, relatively speaking, even though the multinational sector is not doing as well as it was and its growth is less impressive, it is still so far ahead and so far above the indigenous sector in terms of everything, in terms of profitability, in terms of average income levels. People working in that sector are able to buy houses, they're able to buy cars. You know, they have far more purchasing power. They can go into spend 4 or 5 euros on a cup of coffee, which people working in the indigenous sector cannot. So even if there's a marginal improvement in the indigenous sector relative to the multinational sector, the gap between them is still so large that I think that the feel-bad factor in the indigenous sector, unfortunately, is not going to go away. Another twist to this is that between the public sector and the private sector, there's a big difference. We've seen Pascal Donoghue negotiating with the public sector unions before Christmas, and they're going to be looking for pay increases, and why wouldn't they? That's their job. Nobody can criticize them for that. But we've seen a 6.3% increase in public sector pay, and the last set of figures that I looked last year, well, that's above inflation now, the current rate of inflation. And it's well higher than anything in the private sector, or at least the average in the private sector. And average private sector pay is still 1/4 to 1/3 below average public sector pay. So what you're going to have a situation is, and I think this is particularly relevant for the election, is the private sector in the indigenous sector of the economy saying, what about me? The multinational sector is fine, maybe not doing as well as it thought it was doing, but it's still a lot better than, it's still a lot nicer place to be. Public sector is holding itself. It's going to be given the pay increase it looks for, because no government wants to annoy the public sector in the advance of an election. So Pascal Donoghue is going to give the unions what they want. But it's the 60% of us or 70% of us who do not work in the multinational sector and who do not work in the public sector are going to feel left behind. And I think they are in a situation where they're underperforming even the indigenous sector. They're at the bottom of the pile. And looking at the opinion polls, if I'm the government, I think that's the government's biggest problem.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was our resident economist, Marc Coleman, and Marc will be back with us again on next Saturday's show.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.